It was 1978 that drew Starlin's cosmic storylines to a close, and it wouldn't be until 1990 that they would begin again. However, while Thanos, Warlock, Pip the Troll, and Gamora had been taken off the board, there was a bit happening in these wilderness years that connected to them and the events related to them, as well as those that will have a direct bearing on the events of Thanos' most famous tale of all. The cosmic threat of Thanos had left enough of a mark that even those who weren't involved in it were intrigued by some of the elements enough to go back to them. I've divided these into two groups. Next time is the storyline that will lead directly to Thanos' return. This time we'll be looking at the winding down of his era and an unexpected return to him years before his actual return. Perhaps not all of this was really necessary background information for the Infinity Gauntlet tale, but it does show that while Thanos is gone, he's not forgotten. For reasons that should be obvious, I'm only including his canonical appearances. We're not going to get into the Spidey super stories and his infamous Thanos copter. The same reason that we will not get into that time that Doctor Doom was literally tooting his own horn. Our look at the Legacy begins back during Starlin's original run on Captain Marvel. Issue number 34, the first issue after the original defeat of Thanos with the Cosmic Cube affair, and the last one that Starlin would create. On page 6, in one panel, he hides the words, "This issue is the end," in a street sign, written backwards. He introduced the character that would be single-handedly responsible for the Civil War event in the aughts, Nitro, as his detonation and the numerous casualties from it would allow for the infamous Registration Act to finally be instituted. But right now, he's just a bad guy of the month. Introducing Nitro, the man who killed Captain Marvel.
You are technically correct. The best kind of correct.
The issue begins with a coda to Thanos' original reign of terror on Titan with the Cosmic Cube, that the population is recovering and the planet returning to normal, so it's all good. Armageddon didn't prove to be a problem this time. However, Rick is bothered about his role in all of this and his lack of his own life, so he gets his music career going. While the issue brings Carol Danvers back into things after her long absence from the book. She's overseeing the movement of something called Compound 13, but that's when Nitro shows up, on orders from the Lunatic Legion. This issue is scripted by Mike Friedrich, the man who named Moondragon originally as Madam McEvil, so I wouldn't be surprised if that detail was his doing. Nitro leaps in and promptly explodes, which is his superpower. Now you'd think that'd be a pretty short career, but he's able to then reform himself after he explodes, and then makes off with Compound 13. But he's driven off the road by Rick's manager and is peeved, and so Rick has to turn into Captain Marvel so that the fight can really begin. But he's unprepared for a guy whose shtick is exploding at you, and soon Nitro makes off with the Compound 13 yet again, which Carol tells Marvel is the most powerful nerve gas in the world. Captain Marvel tracks him down, but another explosion causes the tank to start to leak. After vanquishing Nitro, Marvel sorts out the leak, but passes out. It won't be until the next issue, when Marvel hits his 3-hour limit, that Rick is able to return to our reality. Now this issue is nothing special, but it is significant beyond the historical fact that Starlin left after this one. Besides contributing to a couple of charity event issues, Starlin had only one new work for Marvel after his 1979 Ghost Rider issue, Marvel's first graphic novel, The Death of Captain Marvel. Okay, well, that's not quite true. He also did another graphic novel several years later, but it was a comedy with the Hulk and the Thing. I do hear it's actually pretty good, but it doesn't count for our purposes. Starlin was tempted back to do this by a combination of factors. One was that his Dreadstar would be published by Marvel's Epic line. Two was that Captain Marvel was actually his favorite character he's written, at least according to a CBR interview, and so the chance to revisit the character one final time was attractive to him. And thirdly, his own father had passed from cancer, and Starlin felt this would be a good way to work through that. See, Marvel Comics was interested in the death of Captain Marvel because, well, nobody really knew what to do with him. Steve Englehart had left Marvel as well, as we'll get into next time. He was the only other guy who really had a solid grasp on the cosmic aspects of the Marvel Universe, who could thus make Captain Marvel work. Frankly, after he left, it was kinda crap. The thing about superhero names, though, is that you use it or lose it. If they stop using the name Captain Marvel, then someone else, say someone who cries out Shazam, could then take the name away from them. So they needed to kill off Captain Marvel and introduce someone else with that name. So yeah, after all of his enemies tried, the one that finally killed him off was the legal department. The issue begins with Captain Marvel recording an autobiography, explaining of how he went from a Kree warrior to the superhero that he is now, until his recent semi-retirement on Titan. It's why he's with a Titan expedition to Thanos' ship, Sanctuary 2, towed out past Pluto by the Avengers in the hopes that it wouldn't cause any more problems. But they've come here to recover something of sentimental value, the petrified body of Thanos itself. He may have been someone that had been trying to annihilate the universe, but he was still Mentor's son, and his remains should be returned to Titan, it's felt. Except the remains weren't placed on this platform by the three of them. Instead, it was placed there by Thanos' former followers, who attack, convinced that the mad Titan who tried to become a god would return. They're not the first that we've encountered, actually. Thanos also had a cult on Titan who cropped up in the final issues of Captain Marvel before its cancellation. We won't get into that, though, because, again, kinda crap. These fanatics are easily routed, but Marvel has a massive coughing fit, despite no one laying a finger on him during the battle. And after medical scans, it confirms what he's already suspected because of his cosmic awareness, that he has what the Kree call the Black End, what the Titans call the Inner Decay, and what humans call cancer. See, that canister of Compound 13 turns out, the deadliest nerve gas ever made is actually bad for you. Even with all of his powers, it's had a carcinogenic effect on Captain Marvel's body, and only his photonic abilities have managed to hold it at bay this long. Now, it's no longer held back, and his premature end is rapidly approaching. In a demonstration that words aren't his only storytelling medium, Starlin shows that Captain Marvel is telling his love, Elysium, of his condition. No words are written, because no words are needed. They'd only get in the way. Starlin is justifiably praised for his skill with crafting a story, but we shouldn't let that overshadow the skill with the actual art itself. There's a reason that Starlin, even after he made it big, kept doing the artwork, even though he didn't have to anymore, or even did artwork for stories that weren't even his own. For example, in a Thanos story in the issue of Captain Marvel, Starlin did the artwork for that. Didn't come up with the story at all in any way. But he liked that aspect of it because, unlike being a writer, there's a more concrete sense that you've accomplished something. As he notes, it can take you a day to create a page and a half of comic art, whereas you could do it in minutes as the writer. Yet when you look down at that artwork that you've created, you have a real sense that you've made something. It should also be noted that a lot of great comic book writers were also artists. While some of the obvious ones you might think of would be Frank Miller or John Byrne. But would it surprise you to learn that Jim Shooter, Mark Grunwald, and Steve Englehart all drew comic book issues? It shouldn't be mandatory, obviously. One need only look at the early image artists to know, hey, just because you know how to draw something doesn't mean you're skilled as a storyteller. But nevertheless, having a background in the art of comic books can be a benefit to a writer, as Steve Englehart notes. Even though you're not going to know what's going to go on the page, you as an artist know what you could put on the page, and so consequently you can make sure not to put too much material on there to then cover up what the artist would be capable of doing. One of the criticisms John Byrne had of his work with Chris Claremont was that he would come up with this beautiful close-up view of a character, and most of the picture would be covered up with a dialogue box of someone else talking, and his character in the picture saying, yes. Anyway, the point of all of this is that the death of Captain Marvel isn't just a great story in its words. The story is well told in its images. One other unpleasant aspect of all of this is needing to tell Rick Jones about it. Not just because of the fact that Captain Marvel is dying, but because it's entirely possible that due to their connection at the time, Rick could have been affected by Compound 13. Except all Rick can think about is how it shouldn't be possible for Captain Marvel to die. I mean, not like that anyway. You don't face everything that he has just to die of cancer. Rick gathers all the smarty pants and asks them to cure Mar-Vell's cancer. But they say not to expect any miracles, and he storms off in a huff. They are actually going to Titan in order to help, but it's just they're not optimistic about it. And each privately wonders, why have they been waiting until now to devote themselves to this issue? The answer, of course, is the paradoxical problem of having an ongoing continuity set in the real world where fantastical things are possible. That fusion of realism with comic books. You can't do a story about the idea of first contact with aliens in the Marvel Universe because aliens are common knowledge. So you're stuck with a bell that you can't unring. Likewise, you can't cure cancer in the Marvel Universe because you can't unring that bell either. Besides, you'd rather turn people into dinosaurs. There are little things being done to slow the progress of the disease, and Captain Marvel has a moment where he gives in to his anger over the unfairness of his own body turning against him, and speaks to the common conceit, quote, "Everyone has to die someday. I just never figured it would happen to me. Deep down inside me, I felt that those special things that make me who I am would just live forever. It's hard to accept that the world is going to go on without me." Efforts to heal Captain Marvel continue, but the very power that kept him alive will block any effort to attack the disease, and if they remove it, he'll die within hours. So as his final days approach, many come to Titan to hold vigil, as this picture shows. You'll note the presence of the Silver Surfer here. We'll get into that in our next part. Some handle the situation better than others. Grimm tells old war stories, for instance, while Spider-Man has to excuse himself, unable to wrap his head around the fact that this could possibly be happening. Although fortunately he manages not to make a deal with the devil this time. Rick Jones actually breaks down, his anger over this finally giving way to his grief. A surprising visitor appears, General Zedrau. Surprising because he's a Skrull. He approaches because Captain Marvel, as both a Kree and a superhero defending Earth, was the greatest enemy that the Skrulls ever faced. While the Kree, who see Mar-Vell as a traitor and are in fact celebrating his pending death, the Skrulls have come here because they are paying homage to a worthy adversary. They even give him a medal, their highest honor. Speaking of worthy adversaries, as Captain Marvel slips into a coma, down in the crypts, the petrified remains of Thanos stirs. Not on this plane, of course, but in the one where Marvel's mind currently is, heading upstairs to visit his old enemy, lamenting this end. So he immediately restores Captain Marvel to full vitality so that, at his end, Mar-Vell can meet it in the midst of glorious battle. Except, that's not actually the point. It's to get Captain Marvel to see that for all things, a time to end must come, that it can never be denied, and this must be accepted when the time comes. So Mar-Vell dispels the illusion and accepts the kiss of death, for as Thanos says, she's just a bridge to what comes next. But in the physical world, his body fails, and his friends lay his remains to rest. It's been more than 40 years since his death, and while Mar-Vell is not forgotten, his death is one of the few that has not been undone. Well, not in any permanent way. And really, few have truly had an ending like this. A sense that death is not a stunt or about nobility, but that it is a different kind of heroism. The kind that can face that sense of personal injustice with it, the personal erosion of it, and accept their mortal state. It gives voice to the thoughts that we've likely all had but not shared aloud. We are all the main characters in our own tale, and the story explores how it feels when we see one character's personal tale ending. Reversing death has lots of story potential, don't get me wrong. Bucky Barnes' death being undone allowed for a great story. But any attempt to undo Mar-Vell's would only undermine one. There's a time and place to cheat the grave, but this isn't one of them. When this graphic novel came out, coincidentally, things were also coming to an end over in Avengers. In issue 219, Moondragon uses her powers to compel Wasp, Captain America, Iron Man, and Thor to come to her ship. Except, it wasn't Moondragon that did it, but Drax. Remember way back in Iron Man number 55, when he first showed up, Drax's mind was so powerful, how it summoned Iron Man to take on Thanos? Well, similar things are happening here. He explains that his journey with Moondragon, his daughter, remember, has led them to a planet consumed by war, but while she's been sorting it out, there's a great evil and only the Avengers can prevent it. When they arrive, she explains that she's using her mental powers to bring peace by helping the various leaders understand one another. But it's a delicate balance that takes all her power to achieve, so she needs the Avengers to deal with an attacking army. They're skeptical, but Wasp, who's in charge, decides to go along with it for now. Yet each of them feels that even though it's intellectually right, it still feels wrong to do that. Wasp and Cap suspect that Moondragon is manipulating them as well, finding out that the rebels were just regular folks who were suddenly given a compulsion to attack for no reason at all. And Iron Man notes to Drax that he was in a position to aid them during the battle, but he refused to even offer a word of warning when Captain America was taken by surprise. Moondragon confesses what Thor knows, that she is mentally dominating this entire planet. The battle was just to satisfy the Avengers that they did what they came here to do so that they would leave again and not interfere. In issue 220, Iron Man demonstrates to Drax how much her help has just been mind control over him, wrapping him in a restraint because the real Drax wouldn't put up with him doing that. Drax finally breaks free of her control, and the others attack as well, while Moondragon puts everything into controlling Thor to defend her. But Thor has just enough sense that he's on the wrong side here to bang his hammer and turn back to Dr. Donald Blake. But Moondragon has got delusions of grandeur up to 11, convinced that she is a goddess, and thus all she does is right. Drax refuses to give in to her until finally she deals such psychic damage to him that his mind is destroyed and his body mortally wounded. Since they've no idea what to do with her after this murder, Thor says, well, she says she's a goddess, so he's going to take her away to be judged as one. This situation took Drax off the board now, while allowing for Moondragon to be utilized in a different way, because you see, Thor brought her to Odin to be tried and sentenced, and Odin passed down one that was incredibly severe, maybe even downright cruel. She has to become a member of the New Defenders. Ugh. Well, the New Defenders, which basically took everything that made the Defenders great and threw it away, and took everything that made the Champions enjoyable and threw that away, and combined that together, well, it lasted about 2 years before the book was canceled, and in a Secret Wars 2 crossover, no less. This was done in such a way that the original X-Men members who were now part of the New Defenders, Beast, Iceman, and Angel, could instead go on to be in the book called X-Factor. I don't want to stray too far. Suffice to say that Moondragon had someone making her act like a villain with that whole tyranny thing. Then it was worked out, and then all of a sudden, well, things happened, so she had to embrace being a villain again. Fought the other Defenders, and in the process, she died, and took a number of her teammates with her. The last of the old Starling characters was thus taken off the board. And also it was the shortest. 3 years later, Moondragon would be put into a clone body and be brought back. Yeah, clones, what can you do? So, all of the old pieces have been taken off the board, except there is still one last thread connecting back to the old Thanos days that's going to come up. But before we get into that, we need to take a bit of a detour and get into the Skrulls for a moment. See, this is a real snowballing situation that we've got to deal with. And it all starts with a disagreement between editorial and the writer. The famous story of Phoenix and Jean Grey, which ended with her death. The argument being that she had to die because, as someone who killed a planet's worth of sapient beings, she couldn't be allowed to live. Well, Chris Claremont had a real problem with that. And one thing he noted was that over in Fantastic Four, Reed Richards saved the life of Galactus. You know, the guy who kills planets for a living. If she deserved death, then didn't Reed do a bad thing? So consequently, in X-Men, Lilandra of the Shi'ar puts Reed Richards on notice that the next atrocity Galactus commits is going to be on his head. Well, John Byrne was pissed off about that, especially because he was not consulted about using Reed and Sue over at X-Men, even in this small way. So Jim Shooter said that if Byrne was mad about it, why doesn't he turn it into a story then? You don't need much to encourage Byrne to do that. Byrne and Claremont, despite being a kick-ass team on X-Men that cranked out what I would argue are the best stories in its history, had disagreements leading to the point of rivalry. So Byrne did put Reed on trial, and in keeping with Byrne's legendary reputation for humility, put himself in the book to be present during the trial. Byrne argues that Galactus and Phoenix aren't the same thing because, screw you. Here's all these important people, that includes eternity itself, saying that Galactus is important and deserves to live. Most of these arguments, it has to be noted, are so much bullshit. Galactus is a test, for example, or that Reed states that Galactus wouldn't be able to do what he does unless it was for some purpose, which, even if accepted, doesn't indicate why Galactus and Phoenix are different cases. In the end, what emerges from this grab bag is one point that will stick, that will justify why Galactus has to live, and that is that Galactus is a necessary force between the opposing elements of death and eternity, without which the universe will fail. Without Galactus, a harmony would occur between the two, and that would be the end for the universe. Originally, there was going to be something else, a tale that Byrne was going to tell called The Last Galactus Story, but the series was canceled and the tale was never finished. Incidentally, and it seems too perfect not to be intentional, Claremont, years afterwards, had Death intervening with Phoenix in classic X-Men number 43, the backup story with Jean Grey, and possibly inspired by that, then went on to Excalibur 25, where Galactus himself shows up to destroy the Phoenix Force inside of Rachel Summers, only for Death to appear and tell him the same thing that Eternity had said to defend his existence. Phoenix has a place in the order of things, and the universe will suffer if he destroys it. So, that's all sorted out. Let's move on. We were talking about Skrulls. Now, you'll recall that Lilandra had said Reed would be held to account the next time Galactus committed one of his atrocities. And Byrne figured if he was going to commit an atrocity, we're going to make it a big one. So Nova, Frankie Ray, no connection to that organization with stars on their helmets, is the herald of Galactus at this time, and she finds a perfect world for her master, the Skrull throne world. An uncarried Galactus then proceeds to consume it, thus giving approximate reason to put Reed on trial for saving Galactus, as doing so now meant that billions and billions of Skrulls would still be alive if not for his intervention. Needless to say, with a group as powerful and important as the Skrulls were, this event was massively important in their history. Years and years of Skrull storylines all have their origin in John Byrne being miffed. In what is perhaps the ultimate indignity for the Skrulls, this also proved a "for me it was Tuesday" moment, and not just by Galactus, but by Marvel. See this page? Do you see any mention on this page of Skrulls? No? Yeah, that's right. The most pivotal event of their generation, and it's less important than the question of whether normalcy is possible for the FF. You know who it's not possible for? Everyone Galactus just ate. I'd say planetary annihilation is going to probably knock you out of your groove. So, we've talked about the Skrulls, we've talked about Galactus, we've talked about Phoenix. Where do we continue now? Obviously, we're going to talk about Vision. Over in the pages of Avengers, he's been plotting to end all war on Earth by taking over the computers. In issue number 254, he announces this. What Captain America notes, this actually sounds kind of similar to what Moondragon did on that one planet to impose peace. And so he works to stop that. But Vision has made this situation hard by taking a number of other characters out of the picture. One of them being the new Captain Marvel, the one that I mentioned earlier. This new one is Monica Rambeau, with various superhero names including Photon, Pulsar, and Spectrum. But what matters is what Vision told her to do, which was go check out a problem on Thanos' old ship, Sanctuary 2. There seems to be signs that it's up to no good. This is a complete lie. He just needs to get these powerhouses out of here so they can't respond. And when a character like, say, Captain Marvel can move at the speed of light, if you want her not getting in your hair, you need to send her farther away than New Jersey. So consequently, he sent her all the way out to Sanctuary 2. So poor Captain Marvel, left in issue number 252, finally arrives at Sanctuary 2 in 255, checks the comm systems, and reports, hey, everything seems just fine. I've spent over 3 issues getting out here. What's going on? So after having to heap apologies at everybody and going all Colossus the Forbin project on them, now Vision has to apologize to her for sending her all the way the hell out of our solar system for nothing. There is no fruit basket of any size or composition that equals the apology that calls for. Well, in an example of comic book coincidence, the same time that she has come out here for no reason whatsoever, being lied to that something is happening, something's happening. Some alien ship docks with Sanctuary 2, and 2 aliens try attacking her. Captain Marvel deals with them easily, and their comrades show up to chastise these guys for their behavior, saying they only came here because of navigation problems and were hoping that they could get their bearings and make some repairs. Captain Marvel agrees to help them, but senses that something is up. And soon, they jump into hyperspace, which not only sends the ship where they want it to go, but in so doing, it forces her into her human form and disrupts her energy abilities. So she's not going to be able to use any of her superpowers right now. What's worse, they've taken the ship to another galaxy, so even when she gets her powers back, it'd take Captain Marvel forever to head back to Earth at the speed of light. And they say, hey, we're mercenaries, so how about instead you just work for us? Oh, and we're about to meet our boss, so why don't we do an interview to see if you should be a member of our wacky gang of killers? Now, before we meet their boss, it's essential to remember, well, what probably doesn't even need saying, but we just need to say it in order to be absolutely, unambiguously clear about this. When it comes to the Guardians of the Galaxy in the MCU, it is very much not what the comic is. The Gamora on screen is not the one that Starlin created. The character of Drax, even what he evolves into in the comic books, is not the one that you see on the screen. Mantis and Warlock, they are so not their comic selves, they might as well be different people. Now, I'm not saying any of this to say I dislike these films or those characters. I'm far from it. But even by adaptation standards, the faithfulness scale on this, on a scale of 1 to 10, is probably about a 2. And that's only because 1 is reserved for, as Neil Gaiman put it, Batman is an investigative reporter who has a pet bat. So it's important to understand that any prior knowledge you think you have about this character is almost certainly wrong. And that character's name is Nebula. For starters, let me show you what Nebula looks like. If you only know her from the films, that's probably a fairly surprising picture. Now, to be fair, she does eventually become a cyborg. Eventually. Way, way down the line. Long past Infinity Gauntlet, in fact. So yeah, anything you think you know about her, and if you've only seen the films, it's wrong. Even the Marvel Wiki can't keep her straight. Just Follow along and you'll see where this leads. So the leader of these mercenaries is an alien by the name of Nebula. And the reason for the Sanctuary 2 is that it's becoming involved in the drama with the Skrulls. By the time we reach Avengers number 258, with Captain Marvel's assertion that she wants to join up now that she's stranded here, Nebula says she can prove that by scoping out this Skrull base for them. However, Captain Marvel's not the only one who's being deceptive here. Nebula actually is sending her because she doesn't trust Captain Marvel and hopes the Skrulls will destroy her and spare Nebula the trouble of having to do it herself. When Captain Marvel instead manages to breach the Skrulls' defenses, Nebula decides to see this glass as being half full and fires a bomb to take advantage of this breach. Unaware of that, Captain Marvel messes with the Skrulls, so they'll finally give her what she wants, long-range communication, so that she can talk to the Avengers. Except that's when the torpedo hits, leading to issue 259. In that one, Nebula reveals the reason that they were able to take Sanctuary 2. It's that many of her mercenaries were former followers of Thanos, and hence were familiar enough with the systems to do that job. While they bicker, a week passes before the message finally gets to the Avengers, who come along with Firelord in order to rescue Captain Marvel. Firelord is from the Andromeda Galaxy, where the Skrulls live, see. They board a Titan ship in order to travel the vast distance that's required, and they'll need to hurry because we find out who Nebula is working for, one of the Skrull governors. With the throne world eaten by Galactus, a whole bunch of Skrulls are declaring themselves to be emperors now, and this one wants to eliminate the competition, hence sicking Nebula and her goons on one of his adversaries. As for the ones that Captain Marvel ran into, they are led by General Zendao. Yep, that guy who went to Titan to give the OG Captain Marvel a medal before he passed away. That guy. There's tension when the Avengers arrive, but Zendao is smart enough to know that right now he can use all the allies that he can get, even if one of them is a former herald of the guy responsible for this mess. The reason Nebula wanted Sanctuary 2 was that it was the only thing powerful enough to get past Zendao's defenses, but otherwise, she has led her mercenaries from victory to victory in this Skrull civil war. But it's clear she's got more planned than working for the highest bidder. She's planning to conquer the Skrull Empire for herself, and from there, probably move on to our galaxy next. So, Avengers and Skrulls on the same side leads us to issue 260. In this issue, Firelord leaves. He hates the Skrulls too much to work with them, but then he soon finds his world of Xandar annihilated by Nebula. So now, he's got a dog in this fight. Although the hope is that there might not actually be a fight. The firepower of Sanctuary 2 is so great that even if General Zendao wins, his fleet will suffer such casualties, it'd be the same as a defeat. The hope is maybe if they can avoid a direct confrontation with her and retake Sanctuary 2 through some other means. What they don't know is that Nebula is obsessed with learning more about Thanos, and later on we find out why that is. Nebula believes that Thanos is her grandfather. Now, why do I say believes? Because it is one of the great unconfirmed assertions of the Marvel Universe. She is certain that it is true. Thanos is certain that it is not true. As a devoted lover of death, he would never create progeny, he says. The solution ultimately is going to come down to who you find more persuasive. Now, myself, I tend to fall down on the she's just crazy kind of side of it. The reason being that eventually she gets a DNA scan and it says that there is no genetic indication that Thanos is her grandfather. Case closed as far as I'm concerned. Plus, there's also the fact, as we find out in Silver Surfer number 5, that there's a reason why she might be compelled to seek out power and why she might be fixated upon a man who, in her mind, is symbolic of power. Making herself part of his lineage then effectively allows for Nebula to tell herself that she has some grand heritage that she's part of, rather than the abusive dickhead that her actual father was. Well, she's not the only one obsessed with the late Mad God. Once Captain Marvel disables the Sanctuary 2's shields, the defenders are shocked when Thanos himself leads the charge into their ship. This cows many of them into surrendering right on the spot. Well, it turns out it's just General Zendao in disguise. Eros calls him brother to help sell the deception to all those minions. Well, things are going very well until the stupid crossover event gets involved. It's Secret Wars 2 again. Ugh. Alright, let's talk about this briefly just so you understand it. Secret Wars 2 is Jim Shooter's Icarus. It's the time that he flew too close to the sun and crashed horribly. First, and most importantly, is the fact that Secret Wars 2 is the sequel to a superpowered slugfest that is now about deep topics of issues such as ultimate power and the like. Now, there's nothing wrong with wanting to go off on some deep philosophical issues and such, but it's how it's carried out that's the real problem here. Imagine for a moment if after the success of the movie Jaws, that Jaws 2 is actually the story of Martin Brody dealing with PTSD from his encounter with a shark, and in fact, there are no sharks at all in Jaws 2. It is simply one man's journey to cope with trauma. Now, I'm not saying that would be a bad idea for a movie, but it'd be a horrible idea for a movie called Jaws 2, wouldn't it? Now, let's compound that problem by making it a bloated, intrusive mess. That, in a nutshell, is why Secret Wars 2 is seen as crap. I almost wonder if this is a form of protest, in fact, what's about to happen, because this situation is so ludicrous, I cannot believe this is the end of this story arc here, yet it is. Okay, Firelord gets blasted during the fight with Sanctuary 2, and winds up crashing into some moon here. David Hasselhoff in an open-chested shirt then shows up to ask, "Hey, what's up?" Well, this Yahoo is the Beyonder, the entity that was behind the original Secret Wars event. He whips himself up this absurd costume, teleports aboard the ship, and then defeats the evil by sending Nebula and her group far, far away. After everyone yells at this idiot for helping the villain to escape, he leaves to think about what he has done. Nice. We're going to continue the story into Avengers Annual number 14, which immediately follows from the events of Avengers 260. It doesn't directly involve Nebula, but it does involve the pursuit of Nebula, because they want to take her in and hold her accountable for what she's done. We're going to spend a small amount of time getting into this, even though it doesn't have any bearing on what's coming with Thanos, because it does have a lot to do with what happens to the Skrulls for the next several years. And because the Skrulls will be coming up in our next part, we might as well see what happened. Well, in their pursuit of Nebula, at least at the start, they're led to a group of very eccentric Skrulls who have patterned themselves and their technology around Earth in the 1930s. They even fly biplanes, look human, have a gigantic Zeppelin as their capital ship, and their leader looks like Humphrey Bogart in Casablanca. He takes them to see his big guest, Prince Dezen, who at the beginning was broken out of a Skrull prison. He'd been locked up for his radical ideas, but says that he knew a guy named Myrn, a scientist who was also a radical, and who witnessed Galactus eat their planet. Zabek, the third member of their group, connected with Myrn afterwards. Their plans were overheard, and that's why Prince Dezen was broken out of jail, so he might come up with a way to thwart these plans. So next thing we know, the Avengers breach this Skrull power station that Zabek has taken over, but Myrn has already finished building this bomb of his. He just needs the switch flipped, after Zabek gets into this special Skrull armor that he's made. Well, Zabek is so pleased, he then murders Myrn, while the Avengers find their party crashed by Thor. Only it's not Thor, it's a Skrull in disguise. Then the party is crashed by the Fantastic Four, who aren't Skrulls, but it takes a little while to work that out to both sides' satisfaction. However, Zabek has reached the switch, and there is nothing to be done. Captain Marvel heads in to disable it, but Reed warns her not to. It's too dangerous for her to do, for reality, and it's too dangerous for her to do personally. So the bomb is allowed to go off. Except it's not an explosion, it's a thing in sort of subspace. It would take a scientist to explain it. The consequence of it is that this genetics bomb has locked the Skrulls into their existing shape, whatever it was at that moment. This genetic bomb, which, when they were already divided, has now robbed the Skrulls of their greatest weapon, their metamorphic abilities. This will have serious consequences for years to come. That's why we've gotten into it. But Eros, aka Star Fox, is still upset that they lost Nebula. He wants to have answers on whether or not she's his brother's granddaughter, and so largely disappears as he pursues her for several years to come. First with Firelord, who wants revenge, except then they stop. Why? Well, because a stupid problem happened. I mean, not as stupid as Secret Wars 2 with the guy from Knight Rider showing up, but still pretty stupid. Another villain named Nebula gets involved with the Avengers. And because Thor, She-Hulk, and Dr. Druid never actually met the mercenary Nebula, they assumed that this person is the same Nebula that they were talking about. So, when this Nebula and Dr. Druid tumble off into the time vortex, well, they presume that that was the end of Nebula and tell Eros as such. But in Avengers West Coast 48, 4 years after her disappearance, Eros has tracked down the real Nebula, who has found some alien tablets, and is copying the information because with a great power source, there must also come great power responsibility. Or no, wait, she might be able to have even more power than Thanos himself was. Over in the main Avengers book, she soon starts her plans during the event called Acts of Vengeance, a period when, among other things, Spider-Man gained his cosmic powers for a time. Well, there's this scientist at Polydyne that has a breakthrough device that could be the energy source that Nebula needs. But what winds up happening is instead, they keep blinking the universe in and out of existence trying to make it work. Cersei, who has become an Avenger now, is able to eventually shield the one room that she is in with Jarvis, Captain America, Thor, and the not cosmically anymore powered Spider-Man. And so, when the universe blinks out and doesn't come back, they're at least still around. For now, it's just that without any other universe out there, they're soon going to asphyxiate. Spidey uses their instruments to find Polydyne, which is still around also. They link their room up with that building so they can make with the fisticuffs in order to restore the universe before it's lost for good, because that would be horrible. The universe is where I keep all my stuff. Together they succeed, though Nebula murders the scientist, enraged at this problem preventing her from gaining power to rival Thanos. She escapes to her ship, unaware that Vision and Iron Man had already been on their way there right before reality was misplaced. They arrive while Eros is being interrogated by Gunthar, Nebula's top flunky, but it ends when she returns to work on Plan B, still unaware of Iron Man and Vision, and soon joined by Cap, Thor, Cersei, and Spider-Man in taking on her flunkies. By the time they reach the bridge, Eros has actually locked up Nebula, using his powers to render her harmless. But that's when we find out who she's pissed off, the Stranger, leading into issue 317. Spidey heads up to talk to him, seeing as how they had that encounter on the moon previously, but despite the Stranger recognizing him, the Stranger just takes Nebula and leaves, forcing the Avengers to try and follow, and thus compelling the Stranger to explain what Nebula has stolen from him, the Infinity Union, an egg-shaped object of such power it could destroy the universe. Yet like her alleged grandfather, she is willing to risk all in order to acquire absolute power, even booby-trapping the Infinity Union so that when Spidey tries to take it, it goes off, channeling its power into her. In fact, she has so much power that she can destroy and restore the Stranger on a whim. And after a case of Attack of the 50-Foot Woman, the Avengers are forced to retreat. But the Stranger has forced Gunthar to take him to the Infinity Union, and while the Avengers distract her, he cuts off the power supply, and then Cersei removes the implant that Nebula has in order to utilize its power. It injures him gravely, and while the stranger's recovering, Gunthar transports himself and Nebula back to her ship to head back to where we will eventually learn is Sanctuary 2. That's a case of out of the frying pan and into the fire, and possibly literally in Nebula's case. You see, what she doesn't know is that while she was looking to carry on the legacy of her dead possible grandfather Thanos, is that Thanos is not actually dead anymore. But before we get into what happens, the thing that you need to take away from this is that the Nebula we're dealing with is not the Nebula you've been thinking about. This one is amoral, hungry for power, and has experienced wielding unfathomable might. It's just that she's about to more than meet her match here. But before we get to that, there are events in play that will set the stage for Thanos' return. The universal goings-on that are of such heights that the plight of the Skrulls is a mere distraction from it. The Elders, nuisances in the past, will spend the 12-year period between Thanos' fall and his return on plans of their own, and will play a significant part in his return, and in his quest for true ultimate power. Next time, Elder Law.